Good afternoon and welcome to this public lecture by Professor Carla Baptista. My name is Oksana Sarkisova. I'm Research Fellow at Blinken OSA and Head of Visual Studies Platform, also visiting faculty at History Department. And it is a pleasure to have a special guest with us this afternoon, who is also coming from a partner institution, Nova University from Lisbon, Portugal, and part of the Erasmus Mobility Program, History in Public Spaces, that CEU and several partner universities have been running for the past 3 years already. And my pleasure to have Carla, to introduce Carla to you this afternoon. She's Associate Professor in Communication Sciences Department in Nova University and a Senior Researcher at ICNova, which is Institute of Communication at Nova. She teaches media history and journalism ethics in the undergraduate course and also media journalism and technology in the Communication Sciences Masters. Carla Baptista is also a freelance journalist and a member of the editorial board of the Portuguese edition of the newspaper Le Monde Diplomatique. She is the author of several books, including Journalists from the Craft to the Profession, Living Memories of Journalists, and most recently, Death and Resurrection of Political Journalism. She also wrote multiple book chapters, including Gender in Focus, in the volume Gender in Focus, New Trends on Media, Feminist Politics, edited volume from 2018, Press, Political Crisis and Coup in Brazil, 2019, Women in the International Film Industry in 2020, and most recently, Transforming Magazines from 2022. Her research interests include media and journalism history, media, gender and politics, and media and culture. And currently, Professor Baptista is working on a project funded by the Portuguese Sounds Foundation on Portuguese journalism history, including specifically women's press publications in the 20th century. The title of her talk today is How Public Television Became Revolutionary, The Case of Portugal, 1974-76. Welcome, Carla, and the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
So thank you for the very nice introduction. And I also want to start by thanking the university and everyone who arranged this meeting and this great opportunity for me to be here. Thank you so much for all the trouble. And so as an introductory note, I will say that I'm not an historian, although I have studied the history of media and journalism in Portugal for a long time. And if I can say something on my favor, in Portugal, we have a popular saying that is a literal translation, I would say, pulling the fire to your fish. When you look at history and historical events from a media perspective, what is the difference? That is, we try to identify the main discursive, symbolic, and dramaturgical resources that define communicative practices. And I should say with that approach that history becomes lighter. At least for me, I find a way to escape the hardness of events considered in their materiality and sometimes institutional dimension that makes history look sometimes like a fortress that cannot move or be altered without the historian having this uncomfortable feeling of being manipulating or distorting history. With the media perspective, we enter a more fluid terroir, like a wine terroir, that gives us access to the transformative dynamics of the event. A media approach looks more messy because we try to capture, and I'm quoting a former professor of mine that I really like, the movement of the thought, or the thought in movement. And so history becomes something in motion, built by a very fragile web of connections and relationships. And I think this approach really makes a difference, because when I talk with some of my many colleagues from history, even when they have a media sensitivity, they always tend to extract things from media. They treat media materials and outputs like dead bodies. And I'm trying to look at them as living bodies with their own dynamics and internal life. In this perspective, this is the kind of theoretical context, and I will put the presentation. It is interesting to analyze the role of public television, called RTP, in forging a post-25 April, that's the date of our democratic revolution back in the 70s, 1974, forging a popular culture and try to understand to what extent or in what extent this popular culture differs from the previous popular culture project that was set during the new state dictatorship that lasted for almost 40 years, from 1933 to 1974. Always keeping in mind that we are only talking about the role of public television, of course. And this was created, this is a bit younger than the dictatorship because it was only created in Portugal in 1958, so in the final years of the decade of the 50s, where most of the mass televisions were created in the countries around Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, although just a little bit earlier, some years earlier. So this is kind of the theoretical setting, and I want to say that this new popular culture was not created out of nothing, because it was like a resistance project, because the dictatorship really worked on an established value of popular culture and a strong sense of national identity that is going to be completely broken during the revolutionary period. So it's a completely new symbolic and communicative project. I think if there is any originality in this approach, is not in the question, because lots of other people are working on media during transitional periods, crisis periods of time of change. But in the answer I try to give to the question, which will be which of the two forces most strongly activated the traits of this new popular culture? Was it the political program that existed for RTP, the television, right after the April Revolution, and which included a certain idea of people and a certain idea how television should work, and a metaphorical imagined audience? And this will be the classic perspective of political history, right? Because even when they recognize the complexity of the process, we always know that these processes are never linear. They always encounter resistance, they are negotiated, they involve multiple actors. But political history tends to end up reducing to the question of who won and who lost the battle. They tend to see everything through the lens of party struggle or movement struggles. And the conflicts around power dynamics always seem more relevant than media internal conflicts. In my case, I try to look at the internal dynamics of the television and cultural field in Portugal that ended up imposing a version of popular culture very different from the one that the military and politicians thought would be the most convenient. In this case, and this is kind of ironical, but we can say that everybody lost, or in a more positive way, no one wins, at least in terms of the main contenders. So the purity of the utopic television that was framing in this time was very soon contaminated by the ugly reality of the media itself and the ugliness of the audience desires too. And I will try to make this idea quite clear at the end of the talk. This was a time of reinvention of television journalism, which incorporated and exercised many of the concepts that only came to have a name later in journalistic studies. I'm talking about collaborative journalism, citizen participation, immersive narrative, solutions journalism, committed storytelling, etc. It was an almost paradoxical movement in journalism, because several things that could maybe cancel each other ended up working in a complementary way. There was militance and political engagement from the journalists, a lot, but there is also the conquer of a progressive professional autonomy. So they were just not only captured by the political field. And there is an openness of the journalistic field to the participation of other social actors. Many of the excerpts of films that I will show later results from a broad invitation that television makes to filmmakers, cultural agents, intellectuals to participate with programs and document the revolution, providing a favorable context for experimentation and aesthetic and methodological development. We can clearly spot in those films and documents and reportage that many of them were under the influence of the realism and genre renovation that marks the cinema from the 70s. But this collaboration, which resulted in very creative outputs, does not erase the frontiers of the journalistic profession. I mean, journalists were not diluted. On the contrary, they gain preponderance and centrality as they expand their social and professional roles. And they were producing at this time something completely new that didn't exist during the dictatorship, which is a more explanatory, analytical, and mobilizing information and performing new social roles. Another challenge is to define what a revolutionary television is, which is the title of the talk. And I'm afraid I have kind of a tautological definition. I say that a revolutionary television will be a television aligned with the values and objectives of the revolution. But who decides those values? And one of the singularities of the Portuguese Revolution is that the group of young militia officers who planned and carried out the military coup, the so-called April captains, you have some pictures of them here, the first ones, they had common desires. So this was not a revolution organized from a party sourcing. Some parties, like the Communist Party, were planning it for a long time and they were prepared to take power since the 20s, but they did not make the revolution. After all, the coup was made by these very young officers. Sometimes they look like children, they have these moving baby faces, and they were only united by common desires. These desires the main desires were they wanted to overthrow the dictatorship and to end the colonial war that Portugal was dealing with in 5 former colonies in Africa. But they did not have a political program. So this political program was set out after the coup. And that's why we have this naive gesture, we can call it, of making the coup and then handing over power, which you can see in one of the most iconic images of the revolution, which is this portrait of Captain Salgueiro Maia in one of the main settings of the revolution, one plaza in Lisbon, where he hands over the power he had just won by forcing the surrender of Prime Minister Marcelo Caetano and the forces that were loyal to him to General Spínola, which looks like a crazy thing to do, right? You just conquered power, great effort, and then you just give it away. Something very, very strange. Also in these pictures, I think for me it's interesting to notice that there is a new visual relationship with people with the camera. They all wanted to be seen. They look the camera in a very bold way. So this was completely new in the visual culture of the times before, and the changes were so quickly. We can notice those changes even in the television program in the very same day of the military coup. So the ideological values were instilled in the course of a process. Then, in addition to the more political aspects, I'm calling policy the process of gaining legitimacy, or military aspects, which means who possesses uses the force, also have a strong discursive dimension, what Foucault called regimes of truth, or Stuart Hall cultural struggle, in the sense that is a symbolic and discursive struggle aiming at imposing sharing meanings. And in this political struggle that followed the military coup of April 25, 1974, we can distinguish two main forces. The one carried out by the emerging political parties, so a civil force of different orientations from the extreme left to the most conservative right, and the one played by the military, who were also divided into multiple parties, from the military left to the extreme right. So we came from a politics that was very unified during the dictatorship to a one that is suddenly very fragmented. These divisions between the military became agonizing after March 1975, so 1 year later, a date that marked a failed counter-coup from the military right that provoked a radicalization of the left and which led to the implementation of extreme political measures, the ones that were more closest to the Soviet model. We had the nationalization of the banking and the main sectors of economy like transport, heavy industry, ship construction, cements, chemical industry. They all went to the state. And also the collectivization of large-scale private rural property, occupation of land within the scope of the so-called agrarian reform. This is one of the pictures of the military that were shot during the struggle happening in this day. And I had here the link for a journalistic piece that I think I'm not going to show right now. Just I may maybe be back to that if we have time in the end. But it's a very iconic, probably the most iconic piece of journalism of this period, since the coup attempt evolves alive. So the journalist is there, the reporter is there as things go on. And we can see the proximity between the reporter and the military. In one occasion, as he's interviewing a military captain, Captain Diniz de Almeida, who is responsible for the defense of the military barracks that were under attack, he even says, I think we are in the same side, right? And he doesn't quite know if on the other side, is this guy a friend or is going to shoot me? And the right side on his eyes was, of course, the left side. So this very polarized environment between the various military factions provoked another coup, this time from the extreme left, of November 25, just a few months after, the same year. And what we see here is a photograph of those militaries from the left side realizing that they have lost. So they're all crying. And one thing that I like a lot in these photographs is that the military cry a lot. So this is a whole completely visuality surrounding the military forces that you're not used to see. The outcome of this coup on November 25, that was unfavorable to the left, as I said, ends up determining the end of this tension and the victory of the more moderate forces, which were orientated towards the progressive dismantling of military protagonism and the strengthening of a representative democracy that is legitimized through elections, not popular power, not a popular democracy that was decided on the streets, but was decided on the parliament, on political institutions that were built during that year, the current bodies of political power. So this is I just tried to provide some general context, presented very succinctly, but our conversation will focus on the year 1974. So this is the first year of the revolution, in which the soldiers who had carried out the coup were still more or less recognized themselves in the sigla, MFA, Movement of Armed Forces. There is a lot of lovely graphic production referring to this period, including the work of the great artist João Belmonte that I took to the poster of this talk. And so this is the first year before all these divisions among them that brought social unrest and very political and military tension. In the struggle for the control of the media, which were central and literally became political actors since the first hours of the revolution, RTP, the only existing channel at the time, was controlled by the MFA. They just formed a military junta of 3 people representing the 3 branches of the armed forces, Navy, Army, and Air Force, and they were controlling the television on the board. And television was quickly subjected to a reprogramming design that had like a purge dimension. So the former leaders and other people associated with the previous regime were all removed, of course, but also had a creative dimension. It was necessary to invent a new television. And the slogan they have created is this one: a television at the service of the people. And we also, again, must contextualize it, because the former television was a very formal one, made of talking heads and gray settings. The picture on the left is from the main daily news services. You can see the visual atmosphere of the studio, where the access and the contents were heavily controlled. Censorship was inside the television. And now we have a completely different television that is going to open itself to whole new protagonists, precisely the ones that never talked before on television. So you have a lot of television getting out of the studio and going and interviewing the people. So it's like the self-assigning mission of the television will be to construct a large portrait of the Portuguese people, the invisible Portuguese people that are asking about anything, including what kind of television they would like to have. This alliance between the MFA, who was now running the country, and the people is an entirely subjective construction. It's kind of an affective and symbolic bond, and became the main source of legitimization for this refounding project, which implied not only a new television, but also a new people. What I'm going to try to do is to show a little how these 2 operations took place in a connected way. That is, television was the target of a plan which followed the strategy, which aimed at objectives which had to be fulfilled in a very short calendar, because the next year they had already scheduled elections, right? So they had 1 year to politicize and to educate the people to be able to participate in a full democracy. All of this should be translated into a program contemplating a set of actions. The men at the forefront of the decision-making process were military, so they have this very kind of rational thinking. RTP was one of the targets to be shot down, in this case more properly, to be seized, controlled, and conquered, no longer through the force of armies, but by the ability to create popular consensus around the MFA. And this consensus became the main source of political legitimization. So this was the building of the new television. As for the new people, because the older one, they didn't like them. They were considered to be apolitical. They needed education. It seemed easier. They will be imagined, represented, and mobilized by the new television. And now I'm going to show you the first excerpt of a film that I think this one. Yeah, this is a piece of a documentary made about the history of television, using a lot of archive images from the time. And this is about a meeting, the first meeting where they set the plans for this new television. So why it's not?
Democracia. Os militares que não percebem nada de televisão convidam logo na primeira semana um grupo de intelectuais para pensar a Os militares que não percebem nada de televisão convidam logo na primeira semana um grupo de intelectuais para pensar a nova programação.
depois agora deixamos-nos, desejaríamos agora lançar uma série de programas de formação política básica do povo, porque, como todos nós sabemos, está totalmente ignorante em matéria de política. Os senhores peço-vos que se ponham dentro do mesmo espírito com que funciona a eleição do Papa, isto é, vão ficar aqui fechados até que consigam efetivamente resolver o assunto.
Fecham-nos à chave, põem-nos água e sanduíches e não só saem daqui quando disserem quem é que vai para diretor de programas. Fizeram-se votações e se calhou em mim a primeira escolha, mas eu achei que era um trabalho que tinha que ser coletivo. O Álvaro Guerra, o Artur Ramos, eu e o Manuel Ferreira. Fomos os 4 que fomos nomeados na altura para a chamada Comissão Diretiva de Programas.
Procura-se uma revolução na TV que dê a voz ao povo, que assuma a missão de o politizar.
É maltratada, fica muito...
Okay. So I think this excerpt is very representative of the whole idea of setting out a new television, right? And the first outcome, I will show also an excerpt of that, is a program called The Whys of a Revolution. This is just a small part of it, but I think there is also a very strong declaration in the end of a military that was running the television, and it's also translated, so I will show that to you. It's this one. Really like the way it starts.
Ao considerar que o programa do movimento das Forças Armadas tem que chegar a cada português, sem equívocos, sem distorções e sem ambiguidades, de modo a que ele jamais seja o pano de fundo onde tudo cabe e a todos serve, dá-se hoje início ao programa de televisão do movimento das Forças Armadas. Paralelamente aos órgãos de informação militar já existentes, propõe-se o programa de televisão criado apoiar informativamente as Forças Armadas, fomentar a discussão da problemática nacional, dinamizar a atividade sociocultural e dar, por último, continuidade ao esclarecimento político do próprio país. Ao realizar o 25 de Abril e ao empenhar-se numa ação verdadeiramente revolucionária que visa restituir ao povo português as liberdades de que havia sido despojado pelo regime deposto, o movimento das Forças Armadas empenhou-se numa opção política claramente definida no seu programa, em defesa da qual se mantém firme e intransigente. Opção política que mais não é que a consolidação da confiança e da mútua identificação entre o povo e as suas Forças Armadas, só possível pela permanente interpretação das legítimas aspirações dos trabalhadores, pela verdade e pela justiça económica e social que a cada instante se procura, e pela isenção partidária por que nos esforçamos, até que a liberdade esteja então definitivamente alicerçada no coração puro e nobre do povo português. Que se entenda, e por definitivo, que as Forças Armadas se ergueram em 25 de Abril para proclamar que a justiça deve ser instaurada por toda a parte, não como uma figura de retórica que serve para adormecer para proveito de uns tantos, mas como um objetivo concreto de libertação dos oprimidos e dos humilhados. A conseguir, a partir da verdadeira democracia, base da sociedade fraterna e da pátria esplendorosa que tem de ser o Portugal que começamos a construir. O tema geral dos programas é este: o porquê e o para quê de uma revolução. O programa de hoje e o próximo tratam do porquê da revolução. Neles procuraremos dar-vos uma ideia, tanto quanto possível rigorosa, para uma conveniente compreensão dos factos. Isto quer dizer, dar-vos uma ideia para mais solidamente nos unirmos na construção do Portugal a que devotamos a nossa vida.
The program goes on. I'm not showing you just images that are a mix of celebrating the revolution. First, the images will be about the release of the prisoners,
Após 48 anos de ditadura repressiva, o povo português reencontrou a sua liberdade. A 25 de Abril, o movimento das Forças Armadas depõe o regime de Caetano. O povo desce às ruas para cantar a sua alegria e a sua gratidão. Abrem-se as portas das prisões. As estruturas da repressão são desmanteladas. Os exilados regressam. Cada português respira, enfim, a verdade da vida humana, a alegria de estar vivo, a consciência de ser homem. Afasta-se o medo que maniatava ou em que se asfixiava a nação inteira.
Okay, let's go. Just lost the sorry, I lost the main folder. Should be here.
This one.
No, this is the PowerPoint. The folder where the films are.
This.
Should be here, but it's now it's gone. Okay. So the next is from another program, which it's from another program called "Politics Belongs to Everyone." Just by the titles, you can have a sense of the goals of the program. And the program means to show how a popular assembly must function. And what I think is funny in this excerpt is that we can see the unpredictable nature of the staged assembly that is performed in the television studio. So television asks people to get in and to do a fake popular assembly because they were doing a lot of those things in the streets, deciding everything, housing conditions, labor conditions, strike options. And so since people didn't know how to organize themselves, they had to provide some regular procedures of how to constitute a popular assembly, how to participate, how to make order come from chaos. And what is interesting is, and we can see in this program, is that people get almost instantaneously at ease with the fact of being off television. We can feel the empowerment and the sense of self-trust as they start to organize themselves to set the assembly to decide about, in this case, is housing condition. In the beginning, the reporter is there and is kind of moderating and monitoring, and then he completely loses control because people take the event on their hands. This is not translated, so it's just a very short experience for you to see. So this is, let's decide together.
Eu penso que é melhor nomearmos um presidente para a mesa. Não, ainda não.
And then how is the family can
Não há
work?
dúvida que
Really
as reuniões,
pedagogically,
as
in terms
Assembleias
of
Gerais
providing
estão
basic
multiplicando no
knowledge,
nosso país neste momento.
have
O que é facto também é que tanto nós como muitos de
This is
vocês
the reporter,
desconhecemos o processo
and
de
this
nos
guy is saying
constituirmos
we
em
don't know
Assembleia,
anything
mas
about how
decidirmos em
to
conta.
function in a
Pois bem,
democracy
resolvemos organizar
together,
aqui no
so
estúdio
we are
perfeitamente
organizing this meeting to
improvisado
provide an example.
programa em que iremos tentar constituir uma cooperativa de habitação. Para isso, trouxemos para aqui uma série de pessoas, um conjunto de pessoas, perfeitamente escolhidas sem interesse, e que
From this moment now, they completely start and they forget their television studio and it becomes a very chaotic conversation. It's very fun to watch. We are not going to do that because we don't have the time, but I think you got the idea, right? Another function that we identified in this new television is the criticism of the institutions of the old regime that is portrayed as being responsible for the perpetuation of social inequalities and the anti-cosmopolitan culture and policy that led to the isolation of the country in a very structural way. And the program, The People We Are, it's another very emblematic title, is dedicated to this task. So it's not anymore the pedagogical function of learning how to function in democracy, but it's to do a systematic critique of the old regime, covering almost all social groups. And in a very paradigmatic way, the first program is about the school, the school of the dictatorship, which promoted the minimal obligatory schooling and the resigning from the elevation of the people through education. In the Movement of Armed Force program, there is a big insistence on the promotion of a new school. I'm not going to show the film because we don't have the time, but it's very emblematic of this idea that revolution needs a new school. School can no longer be seen as a place of suffering for children. It has to be creative, fun, and the revolution also brought a lot of educational pedagogy that really changed the landscape of schooling in Portugal. Also, one thing interesting to see in this program is the combination of social sciences with journalism, because they have all these social theories about education. So they go to the places with a question that is a very theoretical question, and it is literally born and raised inequality. Is this the fate of children? So the idea is to try to see in place if the children of family didn't have the opportunity of having an education and go to this kind of schools that are very isolated social, with very few children, with very few stimulus, they were condemned to the same conditions of living. And the answer, of course, in the end is yes, we have to change the school in order to give this new generation new opportunities of life. With the missions of this self-assigned to journalism, there is this engagement between the discovery of a new practice of journalism and the harmony with the expressive objectives of the revolution. There is a very marked vertigo of discovering a new country, even a country that were before invisible, full of social wounds and disadvantaged and subordinated groups. The fight for the female condition and gender equality emerges in a very strong way. So this is another driven force that is very powerful. And now I'm going to show you an excerpt of a program called Name of Women that set out this mission of revealing gender inequalities and empowering women. So the first small excerpt is a reportage made in a small town where women most work as in the countryside from sunrise until sunset. So it's very long hours of work, and they are paid half of the men. And we can also see a pattern there is the reporter starts to ask about generic conditions of life, and at the beginning of the conversation, they don't realize, they don't have self-consciousness that they are being so discriminated. And it's through the dialogue that it comes out. This is always the same pattern. Even in the program about the school, they interview a lot of children. It's always this idea that it's the people themselves that have to acknowledge that they have to do something about their lives. So the program is called Montfort Day. It's not subtitled either, I'm sorry. This is the formal one.
A aldeia é como muitas outras. Chama-se Montfort. Montfort Cadeira, distrito de Castelo Branco. 1.385 habitantes em 1970. 600 homens, 785 mulheres, sem contar os que estão fora.
Environment of the village.
O vento sopra rijo em Montfort. Ali, como em muitas outras aldeias, a vida é dura, sobretudo para os que ficaram. E quem ficou? Os velhos, as crianças, as mulheres. Em Montfort, as mulheres vestem-se de negro, como se estivessem de luto por alguém que morreu ou abalou. Filhos de proprietários, filhos de trabalhadores, abalam todos. Uns para estudar, outros para ganhar o pão de cada dia com melhor recompensa. Na aldeia não há fábricas nem escritórios, só campo. Sobreiros, azinheiras, oliveiras, searas de trigo. Hectares a perder de vista de terreno baldio. Já não há quem o queira cultivar. Já não interessa tomar o terreno de Albono, que vive na cidade. A terra assusta a todos.
They're just setting the context. Maria Antônia Silvar.
Begins traveling. So this is how it evolved. Reporter keeps asking her about the work conditions, and finally stage turns off the page of husband. And she's asking, "Do you think that it's fair? Do you think that's fair?" In the end, she's feeling see her own life.
Os homens são homens e eu sou mulher. E depois a senhora
trabalha menos. The same topic of wage inequality and conciliation with family life and the condition of self-suggestion are addressed. It is necessary to open the minds of women so they can free themselves, and the dialogic construction that reportage is a common pattern, a sort of Socratic questioning. Journalist leads the interview in self-conscious. This is one of the type of programs they do. But also the program also provides a lot of information about other types of women. I just wanted to show you before the last film, a completely different film. This other film is about the experience of urban and revolutionary women. It's called Women of Arms, and we have excerpts there from three very famous women in Portugal who were very important political activists: Maria Barroso, Margarida Tengarrinha, and Isabel do Carmo. And I think it's worth mentioning here the cinematic aesthetics that is brought to documentary reporting, since many of these programs, and it's the case of this one, were produced and directed by film producers who were also called to participate in this work of documenting the reality of the ongoing revolution. So let's just see a small part of it. Starts with the testimony from Margarida Tengadinha. She was, personal history is very interesting because she was a communist militant setting the place for her husband was murdered by
ligando-se profundamente às massas durante os 48 anos da ditadura fascista, foi também aquele que sofreu a mais forte, a mais intensa, a mais cruel repressão. Estamos aqui onde José Dias Coelho, pai das minhas filhas, foi assassinado. Muitos outros como ele foram assassinados. Muitos outros militantes do Partido Comunista morreram por ser fiéis aos ideais, perante todas as estruturas dos países.
This is an industrial setting where the Communist Party was very important.
E na perspectiva de todas as minhas filhas, 19 anos e meio, todos nós vivemos na clandestinidade, fomos forçados a separar-nos das famílias para que o fascismo não nos apanhasse, para que a PIDE não nos conseguisse encontrar. Ele dizia liberdades.
I just wanted to show you the other women that is appearing. She was part of you can say, a terrorist group that made a lot of armed actions during the dictatorship. And the funny story about this program is what censoring the already democratic television, because they didn't want to provide visibility to this kind of armored struggle that was no longer visible and tolerable. So this program never showed, was never hired. You can find it in the archives. You see, these are completely different types of women than ones I showed you before. And just to end up this more feminist concern that the television took for itself, I will show an excerpt of the main coordinator of that program. It's translated, so it's also a statement, a very strong statement. You will be able to understand what the program is aiming at.
Como há 64 anos, como em todos os momentos cruciais da vida portuguesa, homens e mulheres devem estar unidos num ideal comum, a causa do povo, a causa da liberdade. Então, tratava-se de implantar a República. Agora, há que defender e consolidar a democracia. Por isso, nós estivemos juntos, homens e mulheres, no grande movimento de vigilância popular que há uma semana atrás desencadeou por todo o país. Mulheres de todas as idades e de todas as condições, mulheres democratas, vieram para a rua na noite de 28 de setembro defender a Revolução e permaneceram firmes nas barricadas, lado a lado com os homens e os soldados, animadas de uma firmeza. A besta negra do fascismo não passará. Em 28 de setembro de 1974, a reação não passou. Mas 48 anos de fascismo deixaram marcas. As forças económicas que se apoiavam no antigo regime pretendem continuar a defender os seus privilégios. Às mais simples e justas reivindicações dos trabalhadores, respondem com o papão do caos económico e político que o próprio patronato cria. E para desacreditar os trabalhadores, as forças democráticas e o próprio governo servem-se de todos os meios: o boato, a calúnia, a violência. Ainda hoje, uma semana passada, sob a tenebrosa manobra projetada pela reação, há quem duvide de que as coisas tivessem passado assim, como os jornais as relataram, como os populares puderam observar com os seus próprios olhos. A esses responderemos. Só tem dúvidas quem quer.
I will stop here because we are running out of time, but there are a lot of stories connected to this program, including with this reporter, because at the time she was in prison because she made a reportage about abortion, who was forbidden in Portugal until 2007 when we had the referendum. And at this time it was completely unthinkable that someone will show abortions alive on television, but she did it. It's a very shocking program. The first time I saw it in the archives, I thought completely, it's very violent. And after that, she faced a lot of legal troubles. And only years after, she was released from all the charges. So going to the last excerpt, which is a program called I keep missing the main folder. The name of the program is The Bars That Guarded Us, and it's about torture and political prison practices during the dictatorship. Music is very nice, invited a lot of very popular songwriters that were also doing their political work. I will just leave the song because it's universal and film.
Esta canção foi escrita em 1900.
So basically, this is a poet and journalist that wrote the song of the lyrics of the song, and then the problem basically evolves with a lot of testimonies from people that were imprisoned during the dictatorship. And the most interesting thing about this program is the contribution it makes to a reframing of the past, because it was also a censored program. The revolutionary television never hired this program. It is one of these moments when television takes on the role of public history producer, and we can see the struggle for the control of the narrative. The other programs we talked about earlier were all consensual, more or less, not least because they represented an experience more shared by the Portuguese. Poverty, gender discrimination, low wages, structural social inequality, the hard work of workers, cultural isolation from the rural world. The case is different in a program that addresses political prisons, the methods of the political police that use torture and beatings and deprivation of political and civic rights, and the history of resistance and contestation that had been drowned out by the previous state narratives. Here it's about looking at the past and reinterpreting that experience based on an entirely new framework. And this operation of creation of meaning takes place in the troubled moment that we have already described. And this was the reason why this program was censored, allegedly accused of only enlightening the victims of the political police that were communists. And that's not true. We can see he has testimonies from a whole range of people. But the director, Luís Filipe Rocha, was at that time a well-known communist militant. So we can say there was no common ground in the expression of historian Philip Scarpino to impose this counter-narrative yet. This difficulty also expresses the structural deficits of television communicative practices, because in its self-assigning mission of using and representing the past, it failed to build a support network and connections that would allow its place as an actor of public history to be sustainable. After 2 years of the revolutionary process, so it ended in 1976, television was captured again, no longer by the dictatorship, which did not exist, hopefully, again in Portugal, but by its very nature as a mass entertaining media. After 1975, the type of really popular television was transferred to entertainment and soft humor programs that were antagonists in their designs and in the metaphorization of the popular audience for which they were intended. While until then, RTP was projected towards a people eager of participation, political commitment, scrutiny, and accountability, then it will offer a comedy short story in light sketches that mocks this same desire for questioning, because they knew better. In reality, the people of the television just wants to sit down, relax, and laugh. So thank you for listening. I hope I didn't run out of time too much. No?
Carla, this was incredibly insightful, and thank you for bringing all the clips and for doing all the work with translation. I think this is incredibly rare to see actually this archival footages. So I'd like to open the floor for discussion, questions, comments, and since we're in a small community, then I think we'll have enough time to take everyone's feedback and questions, and we'll start with
Thanks for the paper. So there's only one stage.
Yes.
If you put this in the context of media, large radio, press, do you see a similar development in radio broadcast, for example, or newspapers and magazines? Or if not, does the connection between the political movement and that television channel give television a new status that outstrips everything around it?
I will go for the second option, yes. Television was seen as a central media, as it was before during the dictatorship already. So it was the target of a special operation done by the military. We don't have this kind of rolling in radio, not in the newspapers. They, of course, have their own stories that are interesting also, but not this very coherent program that was applied and lasted for 2 years. Even the military programming of the television went on until 1979, but it was much more weaker after 1976. So the strong years are these 2 first years after the military coup.
Thanks. Not only insightful, I learned so much. I found it really moving to see all that, I have to admit. I have a two-part question, or perhaps two questions. First, you showed us the clip where the program director was elected by the Pope.
Yes.
And I would really like to know, where are these intellectuals gathering in this room? Where are they coming from? Did they spend the previous years in their living rooms? Or were they in exile? Because in other European countries, we have 7 years ago, 6 years ago, movements that really establish ideas and practices of a new society in the 68 movements in Germany and Paris, and develop ideas that are sort of not the same as the traditional socialist or communist concepts of a peopleist or what politics should look like. And so what I'm seeing there is the director to be, for example, saying that we have to educate that they're completely ignorant of everything that has to do with politics. They know nothing, which is a bit scandalous to say that, and seems to come from a time not from the 70s, but an earlier concept of what the people is. So how, where do they get their notions of politics and people? Is this something they think about as intellectuals in Portuguese circles, or are they importing this from other spheres, discursive spheres? That would be my first question. And the other thing is, except for the people being ignorant, what exactly is their notion of the people? Yes, they have to be educated, but you mentioned that all this happens also in the context of colonial law. So who belongs to the people and who doesn't belong to the people? And these would be my two or one and a half questions. Where do the intellectuals come from? Who is the people?
Yeah, well, those are really interesting questions, and I think that the key questions to understand why the whole project collapsed in itself. because soon after these definitions of people are being subjectively constructed, of course, we see that they don't fit the reality. It's difficult to define the people and who belongs to the people. And even among the cultural producers and intellectuals, this question immediately arises. And mainly the idea that they are not ignorant, they are as valuable as we are, and we have to just provide the conditions where the strengths of the popular culture can emerge and gain visibility. So these abstract questions, they were dealing with those a lot in a lot of debates. One of the excerpts I was thinking on bringing, then I gave up the idea because it was too long, it was difficult to cut, was precisely a debate they organized with 12 people, debating what kind of culture is this, what kind of people is this. So regarding the recruitment, it's a huge diversity of people. Some of the intellectuals were in prison, some were in exile, some were very peripheral in the Portuguese society and just came out after they gained this visibility opportunity. Some were academics. For example, in the programs of the bars that guarded us, we have two very important historians explaining the whole context of the new states and the kind of violent practices that were put in practices by the political police. And these were people who were set aside from the official university. They had to go and teach in other countries, one in the United States and the other one in France. So it's a whole mix of persons. The only thing that unites them is that they didn't have access to television before. Television before had a very cultural dimension. It was a very high-class culture, lots of music, classic music concerts, theater, plays from famous writers. And then the format still kind of the same, but the protagonists completely changed. So the writers that had their books censored are all on television, managing those programs now. But in that's kind of the paradox that maybe I didn't talk about, but it's interesting, is that the format remains the same. They're still being very normative and very pedagogic and directing a lot. So this is a propagandistic television, of course. They are not able to lose that connection to the past, even they change the protagonism and the contents. The real television, not the one idealized, not the one subjected to the political program or this subjective construction of the people, which is always politically defined. It only comes with entertaining television, not with this utopic television.
A lot of these motive of the state political and we've seen some clips of those who were deviating from that mainstream being censored. I mean, they're still these people sort of deviating from the MFA mainstream, I guess, we're still willing to cooperate to create this sort of television program. And I was wondering when and if there was any sort of criticism towards this sort of military MFA control over television during the revolution, especially on the left.
Yeah, that changed a lot during those 2 years, as you already saw the political climate was very intense, lots of unrest and lots of crises. Almost every day they had a crisis. Some of the people on board of the television didn't last for a week. They were continuously being changed as the power dynamics were also changing. And yes, there were a lot of criticism, not only among the military, different, very fragmented factions, but also from the journalists itself, because that's what I find interesting when studying the television from this media perspective, is that you cannot subject television just to the political program, because journalists more so discovering themselves, they had power to tell the stories and to be social actors and to add investigative reporting, documentary goals into journalism. So I think there is this tension that results sometimes in a very creative kind of programs, and it's part of that chaos of multiple participants and normative program, and at the same time internal resistance to that program. So that's why if you are studying the year of 74, the first year of the revolution, everything is more unified, and you still have these people in the beginning of the program setting out what they want to say, what is their goals and everything, and then a year later it is already a mess. If you look into the television program, you can see how it starts to divide a lot, and it's not unified anymore until it collapses as a coherent project.
Also like to ask two questions, if I may, because the subject is so rich and very interesting to compare also what happens in other countries where there is the change of power regimes, especially in Eastern Europe, across the region. But here specifically, in 1970s, I would have one question about the audience, the outreach. So what is the outreach of the television network? Is that already how much of the public, the society actually covers? Do you see that they actually reach out to those whom they want to educate and enlighten and transform? So that would be one part of the question. And another, actually maybe two. A double-sided question. So you mentioned the pushing the frontiers of the journalist profession, and a lot of people came to the television who were not there before, who maybe not even identify themselves as journalists. So what happens after this turn towards commercial television that you identified roughly coming in 1976? What happens to them? Do you see most of them staying and transforming along with the programming structure? Or you see them retreating and new people are coming in? And what actually drives this change or that move towards commercialization within the television? What is the primary cause that it's so quickly goes commercial?
Okay. Yeah. For the first question, yes, television in the 70s in Portugal was already very popular media. It started in 1958, as I said. In the beginning, it was very like a niche media. People will go to cafes. Some houses will have a television. There was this collective practice of seeing and watching television. But it very quickly it became popular, became cheaper and popular. And it was popular because of the entertainment it was providing. So that in a country that was lacking a lot of cultural stimulus, television was the main cultural force, even during the dictatorship. And even just before the revolution, there was some interesting things going on as the last years of the dictatorship, with the new prime minister that took power in the late 60s, it changed a little bit. There was some opening in some sectors. But it was only a television to provide entertainment, not information. So the informative part of television was very narrow because they didn't want to invest in that. It was so much control that it was very uninteresting. It was a television that mainly gave the news about inaugurations in a very complementary way of powers. All the power people were on television, on the daily news services. It was a very boring, grey television. So after the revolution, many people didn't have television because they didn't trust the information and they didn't want to see that kind of television for news. They bought a television because now it was interesting. Now it was documenting all the fun and all the interesting parts. So it was reaching a lot of people. Yes, that's also why it was possible to hire so many people, because the informative programming was so narrow. It needed people, and it's very funny when we look into the numbers, we see that they purged a lot of people. They went out because they were politically affiliated with censorship, but they hired a lot more. So it's huge. Everyone was working for television, even belonging to television or outsourcing. That's why they have all these programs made by filmmakers and all sorts of people that were collaborating in a way. And most of them stayed for a period. Yes, most of them are still on television, and are, even if they are retired, they started very young. They are now 60s, in their 60s and 70s, and they're still reporters and doing something. As for the other question, what was the main force that drive to commercialization? I think it was the weakening of the political process in itself. But that's a very interesting question. I don't know yet. I think I know lots of the people that were invited to come or expelled from television. These movements are coming in or getting out are connected to the dynamics of political force. For example, after the second coup, the 25 November, that was unfavorable to the left. We had another purge in television. Lots of the reporters that were affiliated with the Communist Party, they were all out of television. So maybe it's just the natural course of things. That's how all the televisions in the world evolved, right? You don't have this anymore. This is part of a scenario that no longer exists. Television just tends to being commercial when it is allowed to do its own course. That's what people want.
Did they measure ratings, or did they compete for advertisements?
We only had private television in Portugal in 92. So RTP had the monopolies of the information until the 90s, which is a kind of a very specific situation. And it's publicly funded, so we don't have advertising in public television. We have 2 channels now. Just in the 80s, they created a second channel of television. But in this time, it was whole completely state funding, so no advertising. And was also one of the problems, because this costs money and the resources put into television were starting to become scarce. Maybe the rational economics also played a part there.
Which part of the larger global scenario, was it more American type of television, or given the censorship and all those aspects, was there a inclination towards the other side? I was curious. Did they really have a model?
Mm-hmm. At this time, I think the big model was France, but also they have a lot of training concerns about how to train people. And a lot of Portuguese journalists went to have training in France, but also in the United Kingdom, some of them, not the United States. But this idea of the American journalism as the free journalism only started later in Portugal. During that time, the United States were kind of seen as the imperial country, and there is a lot of suspicions also because the United States were really interfering with national politics. So they didn't want to be much close to the States. So it was mostly France, the big inspirational model, and also the idea of a public service television that they took out from the BBC example. There are a lot of references to the BBC. During this period or after this period? Okay. I have this strong belief that media always construct society and interfere with public space. So this is kind of my mantra. So I will always answer yes to that question, even if you are referring to different periods of time. Of course, television had a very important role in defining Portuguese society and Portuguese popular culture during the dictatorship. And it had played the same role after the revolution and during the revolution. It's a very central media. It creates perceptions of public space. Of course, now it's the media landscape. It's so fragmented that it lost centrality. We don't have a central media anymore. So we are dealing with other kind of problems that are coming from this very fragmented public sphere and media sphere. But at the time, yes, I think it was the main provider of social perceptions and political perceptions. It had a great influence on the way people think about the other, the world, themselves. What is not so usually is to see that translated into the goals of the television itself. So during this period, what is fascinating for me, this is disclosed, this is set up as a project. And we don't see that anymore in the media, right? It's so automatized, it's so internalized that we don't discuss those kind of fundamentals anymore, but they are there, of course.
Thank you very much, Carla, once again.
Thank you.
And I would like to invite everyone to continue informally in our reception. And once again, many thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for staying so long, so late.